War has been a constant companion of humanity since the earliest days of civilization. From the very moment that tribes began to form, people clashed for land, resources, and power. In the ancient world, conflict was often a matter of survival, where entire peoples rose and fell on the outcome of a single battle. The story of war is not just about destruction, but about how societies transformed, how empires were built, and how the fate of nations was sealed through bloodshed. To understand the journey of history's most powerful wars, we must go back to the earliest tales of conflict that shaped the destiny of mankind. One of the oldest wars recorded in human memory is the legendary Trojan War. While historians still debate whether it was fact or myth, the story of Troy has influenced countless generations. According to ancient tradition, the Greeks launched a massive campaign against the fortified city of Troy after the abduction of Helen. For 10 long years, warriors clashed on the plains of Troy, and heroes like Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus became immortal in epic poetry. The famous tale of the wooden horse that brought down the mighty walls of Troy became a symbol of cunning strategy in warfare. Whether the Trojan War truly happened or not, it represents how ancient people remembered war not just as bloodshed, but as a defining drama of gods, men, and destiny. Moving from myth into recorded history, the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Persia fought wars that determined the control of fertile lands and powerful rivers. The Assyrians, often called the first true empire builders, carved their dominance through relentless campaigns. They were masters of siege warfare, terrorizing enemies with brutal tactics. By conquering neighboring lands, they showed that war was not just about defense but a tool for empire building. The Persians later followed, creating one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Their clashes with the Greeks in the Persian Wars marked a turning point in history. At battles like Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis, the Greeks, though smaller in number, resisted one of the greatest imperial forces of their age. The wars between Persia and Greece were not only about territory but about cultural survival. East against West, empire against city-states, autocracy against the idea of freedom. The Greek victories inspired the rise of Athens as a naval power and Sparta as a land-based military state. But soon, rivalry between the Greeks themselves ignited another devastating war, the Peloponnesian War. For nearly 3 decades, Athens and Sparta, along with their allies, fought for supremacy in Greece. This war exhausted the Greek world, weakened its unity, and opened the door for a new conqueror, Alexander the Great. Alexander's campaigns were not just wars, they were conquests that changed the face of the known world. In less than 15 years, he defeated the mighty Persian Empire, marched into Egypt, crossed into India, and spread Greek culture across 3 continents. His battles, such as Gaugamela, are remembered as masterpieces of strategy. Alexander's wars created the Hellenistic world, where cultures blended, and trade, art, and science flourished. But his empire did not last. After his death, it fragmented, showing that even the most powerful conquerors could not escape the instability that war left behind. As centuries passed, Rome emerged as the next great power. Rome's rise was inseparable from war. From the early battles with neighboring tribes to the massive struggles against Carthage, the Romans built an empire through discipline, organization, and relentless expansion. The Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage were among the greatest conflicts of the ancient world. The Carthaginian general Hannibal led his army, including war elephants, across the Alps in one of history's boldest military maneuvers. For years, he terrorized Italy, defeating Roman legions in battles like Cannae, where tens of thousands of Romans fell in a single day. Yet Rome endured, adapting and eventually crushing Carthage, destroying the city entirely in the Third Punic War. These wars proved that Rome was destined to rule the Mediterranean. The Roman Empire continued to expand, conquering lands from Britain to the Middle East. Its legions were unmatched in discipline and engineering. But Rome too faced endless wars, both external and internal. Barbarian invasions, civil wars, and struggles for power drained the empire until it finally collapsed in the West. Yet, the Roman way of war left a legacy that influenced Europe for centuries to come. With the fall of Rome, Europe entered the medieval era, where war took new forms. Feudal lords fought for castles and territories, while kingdoms rose and fell through bloodshed. One of the most famous wars of the medieval world was the 100 Years' War between England and France, lasting more than a century. This conflict was not continuous but a series of campaigns that reshaped Europe. Figures like Joan of Arc became symbols of national resistance. The war introduced new technologies, including the longbow and, eventually, gunpowder weapons, marking the transition from medieval to modern warfare. But while Europe burned, another tide of war was sweeping across the Middle East and beyond: the Crusades. These were religious wars launched by Christian Europe to capture the Holy Land from Muslim control. For nearly 2 centuries, waves of crusaders marched east, clashing with powerful Muslim leaders such as Saladin. The Crusades were brutal, filled with massacres and betrayals, but they also brought East and West into greater contact, influencing trade, knowledge, and culture. They showed how war could be driven not only by power but also by ideology and faith. Beyond Europe and the Middle East, Asia witnessed some of the most destructive wars in history. The rise of the Mongols under Genghis Khan unleashed terror across Eurasia. With unmatched cavalry and ruthless tactics, the Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire in history. Cities were burned, populations massacred, and entire kingdoms erased. Yet, under Mongol rule, trade routes like the Silk Road flourished, and cultures interacted as never before. The Mongol conquests demonstrated the dual face of war, devastation on one hand, and unexpected global connections on the other. As centuries moved forward, the early modern era brought wars on an even larger scale. The invention of gunpowder changed the battlefield forever. Massive cannons destroyed castle walls, muskets replaced bows, and naval warfare expanded as European powers set sail for exploration and conquest. The 30 Years' War in Europe, fought in the 1600s, stands as one of the deadliest conflicts in European history. What began as a struggle between Catholics and Protestants became a continent-wide war involving nearly every major power. Entire regions were devastated, populations were wiped out, and famine and plague compounded the horrors. By its end, the 30 Years' War had reshaped Europe politically and religiously, marking the beginning of the modern state system. The Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century represented another turning point. Napoleon Bonaparte rose from the chaos of the French Revolution to become one of the greatest military leaders in history. His campaigns swept across Europe, defeating armies one after another, and spreading the ideals of revolution and nationalism. At battles like Austerlitz, Napoleon's genius shone brightly, but at Waterloo, his empire finally collapsed. The Napoleonic Wars showed how one man's ambition could set the world ablaze, and how coalitions of nations could unite to bring down a giant. Even outside Europe, wars continued to shape the world. The American Civil War in the mid-19th century was a defining moment not only for the United States but for the global struggle between slavery and freedom. This brutal conflict cost hundreds of thousands of lives but ultimately preserved the Union and ended slavery in America. The Civil War demonstrated the power of industrialized warfare, with railroads, telegraphs, and ironclad ships changing the very nature of combat. As the 19th century closed, empires reached across the globe, and colonial wars brought European powers into conflict with peoples in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Yet all these wars were only a prelude to what the 20th century would bring. The scale of warfare was about to reach heights the world had never seen before. By the dawn of the 20th century, nations were armed with modern weapons, global alliances, and industrial strength. The stage was set for a conflict so vast and destructive that it would be called the war to end all wars. World War I erupted in 1914, pulling almost the entire world into a nightmare of trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas, and unimaginable death. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was only the spark. The true cause lay in imperial rivalries, nationalism, and a tangled web of alliances. For 4 years, Europe bled. Millions died in battles like the Somme and Verdun, where entire generations of young men were wiped out. By the war's end in 1918, empires had fallen, maps had been redrawn, and the world had changed forever. And yet, World War I was not the end. It was only the beginning of an even greater storm. The peace treaties that followed left nations bitter and broken. Economic crises and political extremism grew in the ashes of the Great War. Soon, the world would face the deadliest conflict in all of human history. The shadow of the First World War hung heavily over the world. Though millions had perished and empires had collapsed, the dream of lasting peace was never realized. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany humiliated and weakened, while Italy and Japan felt cheated, and the Soviet Union stood isolated. The fragile balance of the 1920s shattered with the rise of fascist regimes, the global economic depression, and the growing ambitions of leaders who believed their nations were destined for conquest. Out of this climate of turmoil came the most devastating war in history, the Second World War. World War II began in 1939 when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, but its roots stretched deeper into the interwar years. Adolf Hitler's vision of a greater German empire, fueled by racist ideology and militaristic ambition, collided with the fragile peace of Europe. Britain and France declared war, but soon much of the continent was engulfed by the rapid advance of German forces. Blitzkrieg tactics, fast-moving tanks, aircraft, and coordinated assaults overwhelmed countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In only a matter of weeks, nations that had stood for centuries were brought to their knees. The war was global in scope. While Europe burned, Japan expanded across Asia and the Pacific, seeking resources and dominance. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the conflict, transforming the war into a true world struggle. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union faced the full might of the German war machine. Battles like Stalingrad and Kursk became turning points, where millions of soldiers clashed and entire cities were destroyed. In the Pacific Island battles such as Midway and Guadalcanal showed the ferocity of modern naval warfare. World War II was not just fought with weapons, but also with ideology. It was a struggle between fascism, democracy, and communism. and the stakes were nothing less than the future of humanity. The Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were systematically murdered along with millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazis, revealed the darkest depths of human cruelty. Cities were bombed, civilians starved, and nations lived under the constant shadow of annihilation. By the time the Allies triumphed in 1945, the cost was staggering. Over 70 million lives lost, entire countries reduced to rubble, and the dawn of a terrifying new weapon, the atomic bomb. The use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war in the Pacific, but opened a new chapter of history. The world had entered the nuclear age, and with it came the Cold War, a conflict unlike any before. The Soviet Union and the United States emerged as the two superpowers, locked in a struggle for global influence. Although the Cold War was called cold because it did not erupt into direct war between the superpowers, it was anything but peaceful. Proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation defined this era. The Korean War of the early 1950s was the first major flashpoint of the Cold War. When Communist North Korea invaded the South, the United States and its allies intervened under the United Nations banner, while China threw its weight behind the North. For 3 brutal years, soldiers fought in harsh terrain, with the front line moving back and forth until an uneasy truce was reached. Korea remained divided, a symbol of Cold War tensions. Another defining conflict was the Vietnam War. The beginning as a struggle for independence against French colonial rule, it escalated into a full-scale war between Communist North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam, supported by the United States. For nearly 2 decades, jungles, villages, and cities became battlefields. The US deployed massive firepower, from helicopters to napalm, but the determination of the Vietnamese people could not be broken. The war left millions dead and scarred America's national psyche, showing that even the most powerful military could not guarantee victory. The Middle East also became a central arena of Cold War rivalries and regional wars. The Arab-Israeli conflicts, beginning in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel, sparked repeated wars. In 1967, the Six-Day War transformed the map of the region, as Israel captured territories from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War once again plunged the Middle East into bloodshed. These conflicts were not only regional but global, as oil politics, superpower rivalries, and religious tensions fueled the fire. Meanwhile, in South Asia, the partition of British India in 1947 gave rise to 2 new nations, India and Pakistan. Almost immediately they clashed over the region of Kashmir, sparking wars in 1947, 1965, and 1971. The 1971 war led to the independence of Bangladesh, one of the most dramatic geopolitical changes of the century. These conflicts were driven by nationalism, religion, and territorial disputes, and they remain unresolved to this day. The latter half of the 20th century saw Africa and Latin America engulfed in wars of decolonization and ideological struggle. In Algeria, a brutal war of independence against France claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. In Angola, Mozambique, and Congo, Cold War rivalries turned liberation struggles into prolonged civil wars. In Latin America, conflicts in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Colombia revealed how global ideological battles filtered into local struggles for justice, power, and survival. But among all these wars, one conflict stood above all others in its potential for destruction. The nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of annihilation. For 13 tense days, humanity stood on the edge of nuclear war as Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba, just miles from American shores. Diplomacy and restraint prevailed, but the crisis left the world forever aware that war had the power to end civilization itself. By the 1980s, the Cold War began to shift. The Soviet Union, burdened by economic decline and military overreach, struggled to keep pace with the West. The war in Afghanistan, where Soviet forces faced fierce resistance from Afghan fighters backed by the United States, drained resources and morale. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and within 2 years the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War had ended without a direct superpower clash, but the decades of rivalry had reshaped the world, leaving behind countless wars, revolutions, and unresolved conflicts. The end of the Cold War did not bring an end to war itself. In the 1990s, the Gulf War erupted when Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. A US-led coalition launched Operation Desert Storm, swiftly defeating Iraqi forces with overwhelming technological superiority. The war showcased the power of modern weapons, from precision-guided missiles to stealth aircraft, but it also left the Middle East unstable. At the same time, the collapse of Yugoslavia plunged the Balkans into brutal ethnic wars. The conflicts in Bosnia and Kosovo revealed the horrors of ethnic cleansing and mass atrocities on European soil just decades after World War II. International intervention eventually ended the wars, but the scars of division remain. In Africa, the Rwandan genocide of 1994 demonstrated how war and ethnic hatred could spiral into unimaginable horror. In just 100 days, nearly 1 million people were slaughtered. The wars in the Congo, which followed, drew in multiple nations and became one of the deadliest conflicts since World War II, though often overlooked by the wider world. The closing years of the 20th century also saw growing tensions in the Middle East and South Asia. India and Pakistan conducted nuclear tests in 1998, adding a new dimension to their rivalry. In the Middle East, Iraq continued to defy international pressure, setting the stage for future conflicts. As the century turned, the world hoped for peace, but new wars awaited. The 21st century opened with the shocking attacks of September 11, 2001. The United States declared a global war on terror, leading to invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. These wars would dominate the early decades of the new millennium, reshaping global politics and unleashing new waves of instability. From ancient myths like Troy to the nuclear standoff of the Cold War, humanity's journey through war had reached a point where the future itself seemed uncertain. As the 21st century began, the legacy of centuries of conflict cast a long and troubling shadow. The dawn of the 21st century began with hope that the horrors of the past century might not be repeated. The Cold War was over, globalization was connecting nations, and technology promised progress. Yet beneath the surface, old rivalries, new threats, and unresolved conflicts simmered, waiting to erupt. The first great wars of the new century would come not from clashes of empires, but from the shadow of terrorism and the struggle to redefine global power. On September 11, 2001, the world watched in shock as planes struck the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. Nearly 3,000 innocent lives were lost in a single day, and the event changed history forever. The United States declared a war on terror, targeting the Al-Qaeda network and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan that had sheltered its leaders. The war in Afghanistan became the longest in American history, stretching across 2 decades. At first, the Taliban government fell quickly, but the war did not end. Insurgency, guerrilla warfare, and endless cycles of violence dragged on. The mountains and deserts of Afghanistan became a graveyard of empires once again, echoing the failures of past conquerors. When U.S. forces finally withdrew in 2021, the Taliban returned to power, leaving many to question what had been gained and what had been lost. In 2003, the United States and its allies launched another war, this time in Iraq. The invasion aimed to topple Saddam Hussein, accused of possessing weapons of mass destruction. The initial campaign was swift, and Baghdad fell within weeks. But what followed was chaos. Insurgency, sectarian violence, and the rise of extremist groups turned Iraq into a nightmare. The execution of Saddam Hussein ended a brutal dictatorship but did not bring peace. Instead, the war opened the door to the rise of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, which spread terror across Iraq and Syria, capturing cities and declaring a caliphate. The fight against ISIS drew in global powers and reshaped the Middle East once again. The Syrian civil war, beginning in 2011, became one of the bloodiest conflicts of the modern era. What started as peaceful protests against the government of Bashar al-Assad escalated into a multi-sided war involving rebels, jihadist groups, Kurdish forces, and international powers. Russia, the United States, Iran, Turkey, and others intervened, turning Syria into a battlefield of global rivalries. Cities like Aleppo and Raqqa were reduced to rubble, and millions of Syrians fled their homes, creating one of the greatest refugee crises of modern times. The war left scars that may take generations to heal. Elsewhere in the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and Palestine continued into the 21st century with repeated escalations from the Second Intifada to the wars in Gaza. Cycles of violence flared again and again. Each round of fighting brought destruction, loss of life, and deepened mistrust between peoples who have lived on the same land for centuries. The dream of lasting peace remains elusive, and the struggle continues to echo through the region and the world. Beyond the Middle East, Africa has also endured devastating wars in the 21st century. In Sudan, the Darfur conflict drew international condemnation for genocide and atrocities. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, conflict persisted, fueled by ethnic divisions and the competition for resources. Wars in Mali, Somalia, Ethiopia, and elsewhere showed that the continent remained haunted by instability, even as it worked to build a future of peace and development. In Europe, a new war erupted in the second decade of the century that reminded the world of old rivalries. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine, igniting tensions. The conflict simmered until 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly, Europe faced the largest war on its soil since World War II. Cities like Mariupol, Kharkov, and Bakhmut became symbols of resistance and devastation. Millions of Ukrainians were displaced, entire neighborhoods destroyed, and the war reshaped global politics. NATO expanded, sanctions were imposed, and the world watched as a new Iron Curtain seemed to fall across Europe. The war in Ukraine demonstrated that, even in the 21st century, the old forces of conquest and empire had not disappeared. The South Caucasus too witnessed war, as Armenia and Azerbaijan clashed repeatedly over Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. A brief but intense war saw thousands killed in just weeks. By 2023, Azerbaijan launched another offensive, reclaiming the disputed region and displacing tens of thousands of Armenians. The conflict highlighted how unresolved disputes from the 20th century continued to ignite bloodshed in the 21st. At the same time, tensions grew in Asia. The rivalry between India and Pakistan, both nuclear powers, remained a constant danger. Border clashes, terrorist attacks, and military standoffs kept the region on edge. In East Asia, the rise of China brought new challenges. Military buildups in the South China Sea and tensions over Taiwan created fears that the world could face another great power war in the future. The 21st century also saw wars fought not just with armies but with technology. Cyber warfare, drones, and artificial intelligence transformed the battlefield. Nations no longer only feared bombs and tanks, they feared attacks on their power grids, information systems, and economies. Modern war blurred the line between physical and digital, between soldier and civilian. The concept of war itself was being redefined. Even as these conflicts unfolded, humanity continued to wrestle with the legacy of its wars. The costs of endless conflict were staggering. Millions of lives lost, generations traumatized, entire societies uprooted, yet, time and again, war returned. It seemed as if the history of humanity could not be separated from the history of violence. But history's journey through war is not only about destruction, it is also about resilience, courage, and the hope for peace. For every city destroyed, another was rebuilt. For every empire that fell, new societies rose from the ruins. For every war that brought death, there were voices that demanded peace. The lessons of history's most powerful wars are not only warnings but also reminders of humanity's ability to endure. The wars of the past, from Troy to Waterloo, from Stalingrad to Baghdad, all share a common thread. They reveal the choices of leaders, the struggles of ordinary people, and the fragile nature of civilization. They show how quickly progress can be undone, how ambition and fear can ignite catastrophe, and how the fate of millions can be decided on a battlefield. Yet they also show the human capacity to rebuild, to learn, and to strive for something better. Today, as the 21st century unfolds, the world faces new dangers: climate change, pandemics, resource scarcity that could fuel future wars. But it also holds new possibilities for cooperation, diplomacy, and peace. The journey through history's most powerful wars is not over, for war itself is not yet over. But perhaps by remembering the past, humanity can choose a different path for the future. As we look back across thousands of years of conflict, from the ancient plains of Troy to the modern streets of Kyiv and Gaza, the story of war is also the story of us. It is a journey of power and destruction, but also of survival and hope. And in that journey lies the greatest question of all. Will we continue the cycle of endless wars, or will we finally learn the lessons of history and seek a lasting peace?